Hello friend. I want to tell you about the Mercedes W163 car. Mercedes-Benz noticed in the late 90s that classic off-road vehicles would slowly become a thing of the past, and that their place would be taken by more recreational, comfortable and faster cars, and not necessarily with such good off-road properties as the G-Class that had been in production for years. Hence the idea to create the first SUV called ML. This concept was timidly tested on the American market, where such vehicles were already popular. The decision turned out to be right. Along with this move, the ML offer was introduced with the 270 CDI diesel engine and the top AMG version. The quality improved rapidly and it was basically a completely different car. Finally, worthy of the star on the hood. In 2001, a decision was made to facelift, which had an even greater impact on the quality, especially of the interior. Along with the facelift, the 400 CDI version with a V8 diesel engine debuted. Unfortunately, a year later, production in Graz was discontinued, and in 2005, production of this car was finally ended and its successor was presented. Probably not, and judging it through the prism of these competitors may be a bit unfair. Why? Because the ML is the oldest design, and you could even say that it is quite outdated. Suffice it to mention the frame design, which none of the models mentioned here had. Other elements such as engines or suspension, fully independent, were already the norm. It was not necessarily a reduction gear and permanent four-wheel drive. Mercedes had such attributes, but so did the competing VW or Porsche. Another attribute was the interior, which is very spacious even compared to larger competitors. Although the Mercedes is the shortest car in this group, with the same wheelbase as the BMW X5, which is 2,820 mm, there is more space for passengers and the largest trunk of all the models mentioned. The frame structure of the Mercedes ML was not intended to provide it with good off-road properties. You probably won't use its potential to build a ferry and you can't count on the ML being as armored as the Gelände. The frame was intended, firstly, to reduce the cost of designing and building the car, and secondly, to provide good driving comfort. Thanks to the independent suspension, torsion bars at the front, it turned out even better, because the car can also boast good driving characteristics. In turn, the reduction gear with a large 2.64 ratio is also not used to overcome the most difficult off-roads, but it is supposed to allow, for example, to pull a tow truck with a yacht out of the water or to traverse desert sands. The most difficult off-road challenge that the ML was probably given was its participation in the film Jurassic Park. At that time, we also had the opportunity to see probably the only off-road accessories mounted to the ML. Normally, it is difficult to get any for this model, because no one treats it as an off-road vehicle. Finally, it is worth mentioning the design of the drivetrain. The distribution of torque between the axles is taken care of by a symmetrical central differential. On the one hand, it distributes power in a 50-50 ratio, which ensures neutral driving characteristics, especially on slippery surfaces, but on the other hand, it is completely unsuitable for off-road driving due to the lack of any locking mechanism. Mercedes has used only traction control (ETS) system for this purpose, which is effective only during very short and calm off-road driving. The reason? The electronics will sooner allow the car to immobilize than overheat the brakes. Engines. The car debuted with a fairly popular 320 engine with a capacity of 3.2 liters in a V6 system with an output of 218 HP. Its successor after the facelift was the 350 engine, i.e. a 3.7-liter V6 with an output of 235 HP. V8 engines are the 430 version, 4.3 liters, output of 272 hydrogen phosphide, 5.0 liters, output of 292 hydrogen phosphide, and the top 55 AMG, 5.4 liters, output of 347 hydrogen phosphide. The most popular petrol version is the ML 320. However, the real popularity on the European market was of course gained by diesels, and especially the ML 270 CDI version with a 2.7-liter R5 unit with 163 HP. The ML 400 CDI version was treated with no less prestige than the petrol V8, and not without reason, because here too we are dealing with an 8-cylinder engine. It has a power of 250 hydrogen phosphide, but impresses with a torque of 560 Nm at 1,700 revolutions per minute. In this video, we will deal with the most popular version, the 270 CDI. What's broken? The interior was falling apart and the leather upholstery was wearing out badly. The early production models certainly had some bodywork repairs due to corrosion. It appears in the lower part of the body, sills, lower edges of doors and trunk lids, wheel arches, floor, and the frame. You have to be especially careful here, because the cost of repairing the frame will be high. Of course, you can remove the body, but it is not as easy as in the case of classic off-road vehicles such as the G-Class or Jeep Wrangler. In addition, creaking and falling apart interior elements, steaming headlights and numerous, albeit minor, electronic defects were the norm in the 90s. Unfortunately, many cases of electronic failure in younger cars are due to unprofessional repairs. In particular, the aforementioned removal of the body from the frame should be carried out very carefully so as not to damage the cables and harnesses. Unfortunately, these are not all the Mercedes ML's problems. People who think they are dealing with an off-roader will quickly verify their opinion when they first check the suspension. Unfortunately, although it is generally a strong point of the ML, it is not particularly durable. There are two wishbones on the front axle. The lower one has replaceable pin and bushings, and the upper one costs about $120 each. So it is not very expensive to repair, although replacing severely strained torsion bars can significantly reduce the budget. Another thing is that they withstand high mileage. However, the brakes do not. When replacing them, it is better to invest in high-quality tuning discs and pads right away, because typical replacements wear out quickly. Unfortunately, the same can be said about the drive system. That's why it's better to have a weaker engine in the Mercedes ML than a V8 unit. In the powerful versions, both automatic gearboxes and reduction gears fail. The latter can also give up after aggressive off-road driving even with a weaker engine. And what can be said about the engine? This unit actually debuted in the same year as the Mercedes ML and was at the same time the first diesel with the common rail system in Mercedes cars. The only difference is that it debuted in the C-Class in a 4-cylinder version. The 5-cylinder variant 270 CDI, Ohm 612, did not appear until 1999 and immediately found its way under the hood of larger models, including the ML. The SUV received a slightly weaker version than, for example, the E-Class. It reaches 163 instead of 170 hydrogen phosphide, but thanks to the torque of 370 Nm it is still an efficient unit in this car. It was combined with both automatic and manual transmissions. It is worth mentioning here that both gearboxes are not as durable as in older Mercedes, but on the other hand, if treated properly, they will withstand very high mileage. Torque converters in automatics are most often subject to replacement. The design of this drive unit is interesting, because although it was created according to the latest trends at the time, it also had a few archaic solutions. For example, a cast iron block with replaceable sleeves. The timing drive is realized by a solid chain. The use of a variable geometry turbocharger and a variable length intake manifold was a great move. Thanks to this, the engine is characterized by a very strong bottom. Unfortunately, this also causes complications. The turbocharger is quite expensive, and the flaps controlling the manifold tend to stick and break off. A manifold with flaps can be purchased for $300 minus $500. Fortunately, a very simple common rail injection system with Bosch injectors was used, cheap and resistant to poorer fuel quality. This engine also had one design flaw. It was a cracked head. This type of failure manifests itself with symptoms similar to a cracked gasket. Who knows how many units with a cracked head were first driven for a long time with a damaged gasket and slight engine overheating. That is why it is worth paying attention to this element both when buying and during use. Taking care of the cooling system and monitoring the temperature is essential. The good news is that these engines can withstand very long mileages, because apart from the accessories themselves and the unfortunate head, they are basically indestructible. Copies that have covered over 400,000 kilometers are not isolated cases. Another advantage is that the ML270 CDI has never had a particulate filter, and the timing chain is basically not subject to replacement because it is very durable. Engine components are interchangeable with smaller 4-cylinder engines, and thanks to the fact that this engine powered several very popular models, you can buy basically everything. There is also no shortage of used parts. Unfortunately, operating costs are increased by numerous, although usually minor, failures and relatively quickly worn out operating components. In this case, I advise using the best substitutes, because it can pay off. The Mercedes ML is much cheaper than newer generation cars, such as the Volvo XC90 described a week ago. And it is not worse in terms of driving comfort, functionality or performance. In addition, if something breaks in the Mercedes, we have great access to parts, including used complete components, and most repairs are not complicated. To sum up, although the Mercedes ML is not a car that can become a motoring dream, it can be bought by looking for an SUV of this size and coming across a nicely maintained example. You just have to remember to leave some cash for potential repairs. When choosing an engine version, it's best to go for the petrol ML320 or the diesel ML270 CDI described here. Thanks for listening to me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and rate my video. If you know of any problems with this car that I haven't mentioned, be sure to write about them in the comments.
I have good news for you. Now, if you are planning to buy a used car, or learn more about your car, you no longer need to search for the information you need on the internet. We have collected everything in one place for you, on the website carme.pro. Here you can find out everything about the car, what breaks and at what mileage, any problems with engines, chassis or gearboxes, which trim levels are better not to mess with and how not to lose money buying a used car. You will learn all this on carme.pro.